did mention sexual topics, it typically took the form of what we might describe as moral discourse. Either embarrassing matters were abruptly passed over, or they were subjected to moralistic reflections upon the flawed nature of humankind in this wicked world. An example of the second type of reaction occurs in the writings of one of the founders of modern source-based history, Leopold von Ranke, who, in his study of the decline of the 15th century Italian states, attributes it partly to pederasty, that he says was copied from the Greeks, pederasty, that he says was copied from the Greeks and Romans and sapped the vital energy. What Ranke understood by pederasty went far beyond the sexual practices that we now associate with the term. Rather, he used this word as a catch-all term for everything that he disliked. This moralizing continued, although the terms changed. Well into the 20th century, when a medieval textbook was published in 1963, it daringly mentioned the word homosexuality in its discussion of the transition from the late antiquity to the early Middle Ages. Homosexuality was placed in a broader moralistic framework, maintaining that the social effects of homosexuality were a fundamental debilitating factor in any civilization where it is extensively practiced, citing the Roman Empire and the medieval Arabic civilizations as examples. We're not as a slideshow. That's it. The Middle Ages cover roughly the millennium between 500 and 1500 CE. This period is particularly important in the history of sexuality because it's the time during which the basic parameters of Christian teaching and attitudes which underline much of the thinking about sexuality, even in today's secularized Western world, were set. Contemporary European attitudes, as well as those of cultures around the world in which European cultural influence predominated, were shaped in significant ways by the ideas about sexuality formulated in the Middle Ages. Attitudes about sexuality varied and changed over the course of the Middle Ages, but there are certainly common themes that look familiar at the beginning of the 21st century. In the Christian world, standard religious discourse taught that sex was something sinful and evil, and yet large segments of the society chose to ignore it. There was a diversity of viewpoints about sexuality in the Middle Ages, just like today. That's not to say that contemporary ideas are still the same as they were then. Many factors have altered them over the last 500 years, including increased encounter with non-European peoples, the development of science as an alternative source of authority, and massive social and economic changes, especially the result of the women's movement and the development of reliable methods of birth control. Fundamental differences do separate contemporary and medieval outlooks. While some sections of contemporary Euro-American culture are still dominated by a Judeo-Christian view of monogamous heterosexual marriage as the only appropriate place for sexual expression, and religious people may condemn the behavior of others in a secular society, these views of religious leaders or institutions are not binding on anyone except their own followers. Their views sometimes find their way into legislation, but this legislation must be justified by some reason other than God wants it this way. In the Middle Ages, the situation was quite different. On the Christian side, there was only one church, and although there was diversity of views within the church, there were some points on which there was little disagreement, such as the sinfulness of extramarital sex, especially for women. The fact that the Bible or the church said it was wrong was sufficient. Toleration of other viewpoints was not acceptable. And no Muslims or Jews would have disagreed about the sinfulness of extramarital sex, especially for women. Sermons frequently taught that the worst of sins could be wiped away by sincere confession, but people still would have been aware of the standard teaching. Not all Christians in the Middle Ages took the church's teaching on sex very seriously, but very few took no account of it whatsoever. In the modern world, when something is being denounced, it's often referred to as being medieval. Condemnation from the West of Islamic regimes, especially their treatment of women and homosexuals, is couched in this language of belonging to the Middle Ages. It sits within a long tradition of associating that period with all the vices that also include superstition, torture, and poor personal hygiene that we like to think we have overcome. It encapsulates the popular perception that medieval life was backwards and unthinkingly violent, and that sex, rather than offering some respite from this unremitting bleakness, was usually violent, deviant, or both. All these stereotypes have been often represented and reinforced by the entertainment industry, most notably recently with the television series Game of Thrones. While this popular program is technically a fantasy set in a fictional world, its creators have made much of its medieval inspiration and historical authenticity. When asked about the sexual violence depicted in the series, George R.R. Martin, the writer of the books, responded, "Well, I'm not writing about contemporary sex, it's medieval." Such assertions have been used to justify the inclusion of countless sexual encounters and scenes involving numerous naked prostitutes, most of which add little or nothing to the plot or character development. This is a world in which sexual violence is endemic, incest is unremarkable, and homosexuality is unnatural. Stereotypical representations of medieval sex are also characteristic of the romance genre, as demonstrated by Mills and Boon's Medieval Lords and Ladies collection of historical novels. In comparison to Game of Thrones, these are rather gentle, but they are equally insistent that this was a violent world, with most of the heroes are warriors of some kind, in which women face constant physical danger. Many of the encounters described in its medieval volumes are very dependent on ideas of dominance and submission. Heroines are often reluctant to recognize their attraction to the hero and only realize their true feelings when they helplessly succumb to a combination of persistent harassment and rough sex. A popular belief in the strange and violent nature of medieval sexuality is further reinforced by the persistent myth that medieval lords were entitled through a custom known as the droit de seigneur, Lord's right, also known as the ius primera noctis, right of the first night, to take the virginity of a bride on her wedding night. Although there is no evidence that this ever happened, it was depicted famously in the Hollywood blockbuster Braveheart. In the movie, Scottish animosity towards the English is partly driven by Edward I's decision to reimpose this custom north of the border. It leads indirectly to the death of William Wallace's wife, and thus to his campaign against the English. It also serves to highlight the fundamental difference between the noble Scots and their English enemies, whose sexual deviance is represented not only by their enthusiasm for this brutal custom, but by Edward I's incestuous desire for his daughter-in-law Isabella, and by the homosexuality of his son, Prince Edward. That portrayal of Prince Edward draws so heavily on contemporary stereotypes of gay men as weak, ineffectual, and bitchy that it provoked protests at the time of the film's release. Alongside the conviction that all medieval sex was deeply deviant and or violently misogynistic, there exists another strongly entrenched belief that due to the influence of the church, everyone in the Middle Ages was sexually repressed while also sex mad. This idea is used as a source of humour in a few films that employ another persistent medieval myth, the chastity belt. This device was supposedly used by jealous husbands to prevent their wives having adulterous relationships while they were away from home, although there is no evidence that this ever happened. It is featured in films such as Up the Chastity Belt, a classic, in which Lurkalot, played by Frankie Howerd, sells a chastity belt to a husband who's about to go on crusade, only then to sell the keys to a whole crowd of men. Later, he makes chastity belts for Saladin's harem so they can go on a sex strike and end the Crusades. You'll not be surprised that medieval chastity belts are a figment of Victorian historians' imagination. Thanks to Adam and Eve, the idea that sex was sinful influenced all medieval lives. Nevertheless, most people opted for marriage over celibacy. Marital sex, if performed correctly, was not seen as a barrier to salvation, and by the later Middle Ages, the Church was increasingly willing to acknowledge that it could even be a good thing. It saved the souls of those who were incapable of lifelong abstinence and produced good Christian offspring. The conception of children within marriage justified for medieval authors the potentially sinful activity of sex. Marriage was a central expectation in medieval societies. It is true that there were many people who never married. Some entered a life of religion, some could not afford a dowry or the expense of a household, some were not permitted to marry because of their parents' strategy for keeping property intact, which involved only having one son marry. Some never found a marriage partner, some were not attracted to the opposite sex, and some chose not to marry for whatever reason. Marriage, however, was still the norm. In terms of the divisions of medieval Christian society by sexuality, the distinction between the sexually active and the sexually abstinent could be expressed as a distinction between the married and the virgin. There was little accepted conceptual space for someone who was neither, even though in practice there were undoubtedly many unmarried sexually active people. Procreative sex was privileged over non-procreative sex, whether the parties were married or not. St. Augustine wrote that for a man to have non-procreative sex with his wife was worse than having it with a prostitute. Procreative non-marital sex was less sinful than non-procreative marital sex, in the view of Christian theologians. That does not mean that everything that two partners of opposite sexes, or even two married partners, might do was acceptable. Between two partners of the same sex, there could be no procreation, and hence everything that they may do was suspect in the view of the church. Not that medieval society had any concept of homosexuality. Unlike in Judaism and Islam, most texts about Christian marriage and the sexual behavior appropriate to it, medical, theological, legal, were written by people who were not themselves married. We do not know how much of the teachings people actually took to heart and followed. The Christian Church, over the course of the medieval period, effectively asserted its control over the definition and formation of marriage itself. In the early medieval period, although encouraged, marriage did not require a priestly benediction. By the 12th century, the Church had imposed its view that any children born outside of a church-sanctioned marriage were illegitimate and could not be considered heirs. For the wealthy, it was acceptable for a man to have illegitimate children, but it was understood that they could not inherit. This had the effect of creating a sharp distinction between the wife and the concubine, casting married women as virtuous, while at the same time emphasizing their role as vessels for childbearing. These rules, however, did not apply to Muslims and Jews. Muslim law allowed men to marry up to 4 wives, but only if they could support them financially, thus limiting it to wealthy men. The Talmud also permitted Jewish men to marry more than one wife. Divorce was the privilege of men in all the Abrahamic religions, and of course, women were not allowed more than one husband. Within marriage, sex was for procreation and should only happen when the woman was likely to conceive. The man had to be active with the woman passive. That meant the man had to be on top in the missionary position to maintain his dominant position in the marriage. In the ancient world, there were 2 theories of conception, the 1-seed theory and the 2-seed theory. The Greek philosopher Aristotle is usually identified as the most influential proponent of the 1-seed model, in which it is the man's semen alone that produces a child, with the woman confined to be in the soil it is planted in. This was challenged by the Roman physician Galen, who argued that the woman also produced semen or seed, and it is the combination of the male and female seed that produces a child. This was bolstered by the fact that children often look like composites of their parents. By the Middle Ages, most theologians adhered to the 2-seed theory, which meant that to produce a child, women had to reach orgasm. To produce a baby, sex had to be pleasurable for both men and women. The Church, though, had some problems with this, as sexual pleasure is part of the fall of man. The theory was that in the Garden of Eden, if Adam and Eve had wanted to have a baby, Adam would simply think, "I'll make my penis hard." Eve would say or think, "I'll make my vagina wet." Insert tab A into slot B, and hey presto, conception would result, with no overt pleasure. According to the Church, too much sexual pleasure is seen as dangerous. The man and the woman should just experience the right amount of pleasure to be able to procreate. Enough to produce a child, but nothing beyond it. No lascivious kissing, no foreplay, nothing after orgasm. As far as medieval church is concerned, sexual desire and interest in sex was a feminine trait. So even though men were meant to be the active partner during sex, they were seen as being more rational, therefore more logical and holier. They are seen as more able not to be thinking about sex all the time. Although women are conceptualized as being passive, they are not seen as passive when it comes to sexual desire. Basically, women are just turned on by anything they see and are interested in any form of sex that might be going. The common idea is of women as sexual aggressors and they're the people who make sex happen. In effect, they are seen as tricking men into having sex with them. Men were warned against having too much sex with women in general, because if you do, then you're going to start thinking about sex even more. And you're going to become like one of those terrible women who can't think about anything else other than sex. From this comes the idea that men who are too interested in sex are unmanly and effeminate. It's clear that whatever the church wanted, many ordinary people would ignore the edicts and take part in pleasurable sex acts, regardless of what the church said, and often deliberately avoiding the chance of conception. The people of this time did not leave accounts of their sex lives, and the majority were illiterate anyway. The evidence we do have comes from the hostile witness of the church itself. When those in power are drawing up a list of forbidden things and actions, then you can be pretty sure that they have done it because they want to stop those practices and actions that they disapprove of. Priests were issued with penitential handbooks to guide them in confessions. Included in them were ideas on how to ask people to confess their sexual sins. This gives us a guide to the sort of things people were up to and includes everything you would expect. There are a few sources written by people themselves in the form of love letters. A famous example is Abelard and Heloise, with their letters full of details of the sex they were having. Another source are letters between monks and nuns, and between monks and monks, and nuns and nuns. So this included heterosexual and homosexual affairs within the church itself. Besides only having sex for procreation, there were other rules about when you could and couldn't have sex. When your wife was menstruating or pregnant or breastfeeding, for example. Sunday was definitely out. Saints' feast days, holy days, Lent or Christmas were not allowed. Many priests discouraged having sex on a Saturday in case you were still thinking about it on Sunday. Of course, this was widely ignored. When the church is talking about the sexual act, they mean penis in vagina sex in the missionary position, and as I said, man on top. Anything else was sinful and considered to be sodomy. Their definition of sodomy was much wider than it is in the modern world, where it basically means anal sex. In the medieval period, it was any form of sexual activity that could not lead to conception within the confines of a church-sanctioned marriage. If the woman was on top, or if people masturbated, either alone or mutual masturbation, or sex between two men or sex between two women, all classed as sodomy. Even a married couple having sex while the woman could not conceive would have been considered sodomy. Medieval people had a different conception of sexuality. They tied sex very much to gender. Sex was all about the role. If you were the active partner, you were playing the masculine role. If you were the passive partner, you were playing the feminine role. They envisaged sex very much as something one person, usually male, or always male really, does to another. So it's something that a man does to a woman. If two men were having sex, one of them had to be acting like as the woman. If two women were having sex, one of them had to be acting as a man. There was no notion of somebody being gay. Two men having sex was wrong because it was sodomy, as there was no way they could conceive. It happened when men who had been having too much sex with women caused them to think about sex all the time and sort out sex became illogical and feminized, and so wanted sex with other men. So basically, men who had too much sex with women ended up having sex with men. Women having lesbian sex was even harder for the medieval church to comprehend. Who would be the active dominant partner? How could it happen? Who does what to whom? They knew it happened though, which brings us on to we know dildos were used in medieval times. Although none survived, there are mention of them in the writings and there are receipts for their sale. A leather worker in what is now the Netherlands noted down that he was paid to make a red leather strap-on for one woman customer. They are also prominent in the penitential literature. There are whole sections dedicated to questioning women on their use of dildos, either on themselves to masturbate or on other women, sometimes using strap-on dildos. One such question was, have you done what certain women are accustomed to do, that is, to make some sort of device or implement in the shape of a male member of the size to match your desire? In other words, have you made a dildo? Priests were also instructed to ask, have you fastened it to the area of your genitals or those of another with some form of fastenings, and you have fornicated with other women, or others have done with a similar instrument or another sort with you? So that is, did you then take the dildo and use it as a strap-on with another woman? These references to people making dildos themselves indicate that women on a budget might be making their own from whatever sources they had available. In particular, it's thought they may have used wood or ceramics to custom make the dildo of their dreams. There is no concept of a woman's sexuality, but they do this because they are naturally horny and always seeking sex. Within both the Christian and Muslim societies, prostitution was never illegal, and there was strong evidence that pious religious endowments profited from the sex trade. From St. Augustine onwards, ecclesiastical discussions of prostitution indicate it was a necessary evil in an imperfect world. Thomas Aquinas wrote that prostitution is the cesspool that keeps the city of God clean. Christian medieval attitudes to prostitutes are perhaps mostly comparable to their attitudes to Jewish moneylenders, in that their existence was incompatible with church teachings and discomforted many, but they were tolerated because their services were socially useful. At this time, men were seen as being hot and dry, and when they had sex, they expelled some of their hotness and dryness. But if they aren't having sex, then it can build up and result in violence. Therefore, men need to have non-marital sex, and it was better for him to have sex with a prostitute rather than with an honest woman, or masturbate, or worse still, another man. In Europe, prostitutes were usually confined to spaces next to or outside the city walls. All cities had walls in medieval times. An example of this is London, where prostitutes and brothels were situated in Southwark, just outside the walls of the city. The land here was owned by the Bishop of Winchester, and so the prostitutes became known colloquially as the Winchester geese. In the Holy Roman Empire, brothels were given municipal charters to establish their legal standings. Prostitutes were expected to distinguish themselves from respectable women by their dress. In various places, the law decreed that medieval prostitutes were not allowed to wear jewels, embroidery, or any other finery. In England, they were required to wear black and white striped hoods of ray. This was partly to discourage other women from trying prostitution to make some money, and to remind everybody that prostitutes were lower status. Across Europe, there were other rules, such as being banned from wearing fur-lined hoods or forced to wear some type of badge or decoration on their dress. Even given the stigma and all the legal restrictions, plenty of women still took up sex work. The reason for this is not tied to a specific family. Is tied to the fact that some women were not tied to a specific family, plot of land or trade. It's one of the only forms of work available to them. A single woman could support herself through sex work, and sometimes very handsomely. We can see this from the medieval lives of some of the so-called prostitute saints, like Saint Mary of Egypt. Brothel life was not considered to be that bad in the medieval period. An ongoing trope in these saints' lives was that these women were not just sex workers, but celebrated sex workers who were making a lot of money. This is part of why they were made saints. When they decided to give it all up for Christ, they weren't just giving up a life full of sex, but a luxurious life. And this is what made them holy. If they had been totally poor, then dedicating themselves to a life of poverty and praying wouldn't have been very impressive. Of course, there were many more poor and exploited sex workers in medieval times, but even they were not considered unredeemable. If a woman wanted to stop, she would go to the nearest priest and confess her sins, and the penance was usually to get married and raise a family. Another route out of sex work was to join the Magdalens, an order of nuns originally made up of repentant prostitutes. Although sex work was seen as necessary for society to function, the prostitutes still had to ask forgiveness for their sins, but in doing so, they could come back into the mainstream society at any time. If they didn't, they would die outside of communion with the church. They would have to be buried in unconsecrated ground, like the Crossbones graveyard in Southwark. Medieval law clearly condemned rape. Laws of rape tended to be brutal. Forcing a woman to have sex against her will was most definitely a crime to be punished with castration, blinding, or hanging. Women across the social spectrum could bring an appeal of rape, and it was understood that the rape of sex workers was still rape. Assaulting an intoxicated or unconscious person could also be defined as rape. Even if laws about rape were stringent and uncompromising, their prosecution looked very different. Then as now, only a small proportion resulted in a conviction, and most women would have been unable to access the means to bring the case in the first place. When men were found guilty, most often the legally stipulated punishment was not applied, and they were simply fined. And sometimes their punishment was to marry the woman they raped. Because of the 2C theory, it was thought that if a woman was legitimately raped, she could not conceive. If she did get pregnant, then it couldn't have been rape, and in such cases, the woman would be sentenced to imprisonment herself. The burden of proof was extremely high. The victim survivor had to report the rape immediately, and neighbours needed to have heard their screams. The onus was on the victim also to prove non-consent, that she had fought back and resisted in every way possible. A major difference between sex in the Middle Ages and today is the extent to which they can be separated from reproduction. The impact of the availability of reliable forms of birth control on all homosexual relations, including marital, can hardly be overestimated. The effects of the link between sex and reproduction would have been greater of women than men, since they were the ones whose lives were changed by pregnancy. But for men too, heterosexual intercourse was supposed to be an act of conception as well as an act of pleasure. There was not one universal attitude towards fertility control during the medieval period, and there were changes in attitudes throughout the period. Some church officials were more lenient towards societal needs for reproductive control practices. Others were more stringent in their disapproval. Early medieval Christian theologians focused on the condemnation of reproductive control, asserting that it was immoral and contrary to God's intent. High medieval theologians, while agreeing with those assertions, attempted to forgive some of the instances of fertility control, especially in the poorer classes, for fear of continual social instability and increased monetary pressure on the church to support these populations. Early and high medieval legal standards also reflect this shifting attitude towards reproductive control. Utilization of methods of abortion and contraception, although deemed to be contrary to the will of God, were not consistently prosecuted as a criminal activity. There were many theologians who, out of sympathy for the women, attempted to provide methods to alleviate her labour pain or to avoid conception altogether. The dangers of childbirth were well known in this period, and the overall consensus, although officially against any form of controlling procreation, was also sympathetic to the dangers that awaited women and the social implications that the loss of a mother would have on a family structure if she was to die from an unwanted pregnancy. Methods of preventing conception or ending a pregnancy altogether circulated amongst medieval medical practitioners. The 12th century Trotula text gives some examples of the methods used. A method which would appear to have at least some chance of success was the use of vaginal suppository made of wool steeped in some gummy substance such as cedar oil or gum arabic to limit the liveliness of the sperm. If this did not work, a sneeze at the optimum moment of ejaculation might deter the sperm. It's known that wealthy medieval wives did practice birth control successfully by using their womanly wiles. We're not sure what this exactly entailed. The frequency with which they practiced, as well as the extent to which they were known amongst the lower illiterate classes, is difficult to determine. But it seems that religious ideal was often diminished by earthly realities. In the 12th century, ending a pregnancy was not a crime until the fetus acquired limbs. Another stipulation was that this occurred 40 to 80 days after conception, depending on whether the child was a boy, that was 40 days, or a girl, 80 days. Although any form of fertility control was considered sinful, it was only a crime if it was after quickening. This was comparable to murder. The quickening is when the woman would feel the baby inside her. It was only after the Protestant Reformation that it was thought that the baby developed a soul on conception. Muslim scholars viewed abortion as permissible if the pregnancy was terminated before 120 days. Before that time, the fetus did not have a soul. This meant that abortion was not seen as a termination of life. It's harder to determine the Jewish attitude, but it seems very similar to the one seen in Islamic culture. In Jewish society, contraception was not forbidden under specific circumstances. Jewish culture also allowed marital intercourse when the woman was pregnant, rather than just prohibiting it. In the Muslim world, the evidence suggests that contraception is permitted. Having large families may have been considered a good thing, as it was some way found favourable in God's eyes, but contraception wasn't considered sinful. It's not like avoiding God's plan, as it was in Christianity. There's a flow chart there of all the various ways to give you a bit of a guide to how you should have sex. Modern conceptions of the medieval period are often way off the mark. It spans a millennium and there are significant changes during that time. They did learn from ancient Greek and Roman texts, and they learned from the Islamic world. Although the church tried to regulate people's lives, particularly their sex lives, it's hard to judge how effective this was. The simple fact that the church spent a lot of its energy telling people to stop doing things indicates they struggled to maintain control. There was no morality police or priests spying on parishioners. Although nominally celibate, we know that priests, monks and nuns all engaged in sexual activity. There was no priest hiding under the bed to leap out. And the penitential literature shows us that they were trying to play catch up with what people were actually doing. Thank you. That's the end.
Thank you.
You all right?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
really interesting.
It was.
Yeah.